The first sign something was wrong wasn't the missing patrol or the radio silence, it was the smell. Even through our gas masks and chemical filters, we could detect it seeping through the containment barriers, the stench of decay mixed with something else, something that made your brain itch just from breathing it in. That's when I knew our mission briefing hadn't prepared us for what we were walking into.
The briefing had been classified beyond anything I'd seen in my 12 years with the 10th Special Forces Group. Colonel Petrov, our Soviet liaison officer, had delivered it personally, in a sterile room deep beneath the Kremlin, his face bearing the expression of a man who'd seen photographs he wished he could forget. "Gentlemen," he'd begun, his English heavily accented but precise, "what I am about to tell you violates several international treaties and endangers both our nation's security. But the alternative is potentially the end of human civilization." 6 months after the Chernobyl disaster, joint American-Soviet research teams had been conducting classified studies within the exclusion zone, trying to understand the long-term effects of the radiation release. What they'd discovered had nothing to do with atomic energy and everything to do with something far older and more dangerous than nuclear technology. The radiation hadn't just poisoned the land around Chernobyl. It had awakened something that had been dormant beneath the Ukrainian soil for thousands of years. My team consisted of 4 specialists. Myself as team leader and biochemical warfare expert, Staff Sergeant Maria Kowalski on communications and Russian language, Sergeant First Class James Park handling explosives and engineering, and Specialist Robert Hayes providing medical and scientific support. We'd been chosen specifically because we'd all worked classified bioweapon containment operations and had the security clearances necessary for joint US-Soviet operations. The mission parameters were deceptively simple. Infiltrate the exclusion zone, locate and assess a biological anomaly that had eliminated 2 previous research teams, and implement what the Soviets called the Blackwater Protocol, a containment procedure that neither government wanted to explain in detail. "Radiation readings are off the charts," Hayes reported, checking his dosimeter as we moved through the overgrown forest. "But the biological activity here, it's like the radiation is feeding the plant growth instead of killing it." Kowalski was monitoring Soviet military frequencies, listening for any indication that this was some kind of elaborate trap. The Cold War was far from over, and the idea of American Special Operations troops working inside the Soviet Union was unprecedented. The first research station we encountered proved her point. It was a prefabricated structure that should have housed a team of 6 scientists and their military security detail. According to our intelligence, they'd been conducting soil and vegetation samples for radiation analysis. What we found was equipment that had been running untended for weeks, automated systems continuing their data collection while their operators were nowhere to be found. But the readings those systems were recording defied everything we knew about radiation effects. "The contamination isn't decreasing over time," Hayes said, studying printouts from the station's computers. "It's being absorbed by the local flora and fauna, concentrated rather than dispersed. And look at these biological samples." He handed me a series of photographs that had been automatically printed by the station's analysis equipment. They showed plant and animal tissue that had been exposed to radiation, but instead of showing the cellular damage you'd expect, the samples displayed unprecedented growth and adaptation. Leaves that had developed structures resembling neural networks, root systems that showed signs of coordinated behavior across multiple plants, animal tissue samples that appeared to be regenerating even after death. Park was examining the station's security systems, trying to determine what had happened to the research team. No signs of struggle, no indication of evacuation. It's like they just left. But all their personal effects are still here, including classified documents they never would have abandoned. That's when Kowalski's radio crackled to life with a transmission that made us all freeze. "American team, this is Research Station Alpha. We have been monitoring your approach. Please respond for coordination of joint scientific efforts. The voice was speaking English with a slight Russian accent, professional and calm. But Research Station Alpha had been abandoned for 3 weeks, and according to our intelligence, all personnel were missing and presumed dead. I keyed my radio carefully. Research Station Alpha, this is Charlie Team. What is your current status and personnel count? The response came immediately. Charlie Team, we are continuing our assigned research objectives with full personnel complement. Recommend you proceed to coordinates Delta 77 for mission briefing and equipment resupply. The coordinates led deeper into the exclusion zone, toward the reactor complex itself. But something about the transmission bothered me. The voice was too calm, too professional for scientists who had been isolated in a radiation zone for 3 weeks after their colleagues had gone missing. Hayes was studying his radiation detector with growing concern. The readings are climbing as we move toward those coordinates. Whatever's at that location is significantly more contaminated than anything we've encountered so far. But we had our orders, and the joint nature of this operation meant we couldn't abort without authorization from both governments. We continued deeper into the zone, following game trails that showed signs of heavy use despite the fact that most wildlife should have fled the radiation. The animals we did encounter were wrong in ways that made my training in biological warfare seem inadequate. Deer that moved in perfect coordination like a single organism. Birds that flew in formations too complex for natural flocking behavior. Insects that seemed to observe us with an intelligence that insects shouldn't possess. It's like the radiation created some kind of collective consciousness, Hayes whispered, documenting the behavior with his camera. The neural development in the plant samples, the coordinated animal behavior. Something is connecting all the biological systems in this region. Park had been quiet since we'd left the first research station, but now he stopped suddenly, his rifle trained on something ahead of us. Movement front, he called softly. Humanoid figures, approximately 200 meters. Through our scopes, we could see them. People in radiation suits and scientific equipment, moving between the trees in what appeared to be normal research activities. They were collecting samples, taking readings, documenting their findings just like any scientific expedition. But their movements were too synchronized, too coordinated. They worked together with the same fluid precision we'd observed in the wildlife, never speaking, never needing to communicate verbally to coordinate their activities. Those are the missing researchers, Kowalski said, her voice tight with tension. I recognize the equipment configurations from our briefing photos. The question was whether they were still human or something else wearing their forms. As we moved closer, trying to maintain observation without being detected, we began to hear something that made the hair on my arms stand up. The researchers were humming, not individually but in perfect harmony, creating a complex musical pattern that seemed to resonate through the forest itself. And the plants were responding, leaves turning toward the sound, branches swaying in rhythm, flowers opening and closing in time with the melody. They're communicating with the environment, Hayes realized. The radiation didn't just create a collective consciousness, it made them part of it. That's when one of the researchers turned and looked directly at our concealment position, despite being 200 meters away and behind multiple layers of forest cover. The figure raised its hand in what appeared to be a friendly wave. Then all of them stopped their activities and began walking toward us with that same fluid coordination. We fell back to a defensive position behind a fallen tree, but the researchers didn't approach aggressively. They simply arranged themselves in a semicircle about 50 meters away and waited, their faces hidden behind radiation masks and protective visors. Then one of them spoke, and the voice was the same one we'd heard on the radio. American team, you have come to investigate the biological anomaly. We would like to show you what we have discovered. The voice was coming from all of them simultaneously, perfectly synchronized speech from multiple mouths. Whatever had happened to them, they were no longer functioning as individuals. "Who are you?" I called out, keeping my rifle trained on the lead figure. "We are Research Station Alpha, Beta, and Gamma. We are the soil samples and vegetation studies. We are the wildlife population assessments. We are everything that has been touched by the gift of connection." Hayes was frantically checking his radiation detector. "The readings are spiking every time they speak. Whatever they've become, they're generating some kind of energy field. The gift," the collective voice continued, "allows us to see the connections between all living things. The radiation was not contamination, it was catalyst. It opened pathways that have always existed but were previously invisible to human perception." Park was studying the researchers through his scope. "Their equipment shows signs of modification. They've been changing their scientific instruments, adapting them for purposes that aren't in any manual. We invite you to join our research," the collective voice offered, "to see what we have seen, to understand what humanity could become if it embraced connection rather than isolation." The offer was tempting in a way that set off every alarm in my biochemical warfare training. Whatever had happened to these researchers, it was affecting their perception of reality in ways that made them believe they were experiencing something beneficial rather than dangerous. "What happened to your individual identities?" Kowalski asked, her linguistic training making her naturally curious about the communication patterns we were observing. "Identity is isolation," they responded. "Separation is suffering. We have moved beyond the limitations of individual consciousness into something greater." But even as they spoke, I noticed something that suggested their transformation wasn't as complete as they claimed. Occasionally, one of the figures would make a small, independent movement, a head shake, a hand gesture, a shift in posture that didn't match the others, as if part of their original personalities were still fighting against whatever had absorbed them. "We need to implement the Blackwater Protocol," I decided. "Whatever this is, it's spreading, and we can't allow it to reach populated areas." The protocol, according to our briefing materials, involved the deployment of a specialized biological agent designed to neutralize anomalous organic networks. The Soviets had developed it specifically for this situation, though they'd been vague about how they'd known such a countermeasure would be needed. As we prepared to withdraw and establish a safe distance for protocol implementation, the researchers began moving again. But this time they weren't approaching us. They were spreading out, taking positions that would allow them to observe our movements from multiple angles. "They know what we're planning," Park realized. "Somehow they've anticipated our tactical response." That's when we heard more voices in the forest around us. Not the synchronized speech of the collective, but individual human voices calling out in languages from around the world. English, Russian, German, French, Chinese, researchers and military personnel from multiple nations, all speaking at once. "How many international teams have been sent into this zone?" Hayes asked, his medical training making him focus on the scope of the contamination event. The answer came from the collective. 17 nations have sent investigation teams, 137 researchers and military specialists. All have chosen to join our research when they understood the significance of what we have discovered. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a Soviet problem or even a Cold War issue. This was an international incident that governments around the world were trying to contain through secrecy and military action, rather than scientific cooperation. And all of those containment attempts had failed because the entity was using the expertise of every team sent against it to improve its own understanding of human tactics and technology. Kowalski was monitoring radio frequencies, trying to establish contact with our extraction team. But instead of our expected communication channels, She was picking up transmissions from military units that had been declared lost or destroyed in unrelated operations throughout Eastern Europe. "I'm hearing voices from a Spetsnaz team that went missing in Siberia last year," she reported. "British SAS operators who were reported killed in a training accident. German GSG-9 personnel who supposedly died in a terrorist incident." The entity wasn't just absorbing people within the exclusion zone. It was somehow connected to similar phenomena occurring across multiple locations, creating a network of collective consciousness that spanned continents. Hayes was studying his biological warfare detection equipment with growing alarm. The agent we're supposed to deploy, it's not designed to neutralize this phenomenon. It's designed to accelerate it. The realization hit us all simultaneously. The Blackwater Protocol wasn't a containment measure. It was a dispersal mechanism. Someone, possibly within multiple governments, wanted this collective consciousness to spread. "We're not here to stop this thing," I said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "We're here to help it expand beyond the exclusion zone." The researchers had stopped their movements, waiting patiently as we processed the truth about our mission. When the collective spoke again, its voice carried a note of something that might have been sympathy. "Your government selected you because your psychological profile suggested you would be capable of making the difficult choice between individual survival and species evolution." They were correct. Park was checking his demolitions equipment, looking for ways to improvise a solution to a problem that had just become exponentially more complex. "If we can't use the protocol as designed, maybe we can modify it. Turn it into an actual containment tool instead of a dispersal mechanism." But Hayes shook his head, his scientific background making him understand the implications more clearly than the rest of us. "The biological agent is too sophisticated for field modification. And even if we could change it, we don't understand the entity well enough to know what would actually stop it." That's when we heard helicopters approaching from the south, the extraction team arriving on schedule to collect us and the deployed protocol agent. Helicopters that would carry whatever we'd released back to bases in multiple countries, where it would be studied and inevitably escape into the general population. "We have a choice," I announced, making a command decision that would either save humanity or doom it. "We can complete our mission as briefed and potentially enable the spread of this phenomenon worldwide. Or we can go rogue and try to find a real containment solution." Kowalski was already switching her radio to emergency frequencies, preparing to broadcast warnings to any military units in the region. "If we're going rogue, we need to assume our own governments will treat us as hostile forces." The collective of researchers had begun moving again, but this time they were withdrawing deeper into the forest. As they retreated, their synchronized voice carried one final message. "The choice is not between individual and collective consciousness. The choice is between evolution and extinction." The radiation merely revealed what was always true. Humanity's survival depends on connection, not separation. The helicopters were getting closer, and we had minutes to decide whether to implement a protocol that might doom our species or defy our orders and risk being labeled traitors by multiple governments. Park was already rigging his explosives to destroy the protocol deployment system. "If we're doing this, we're doing it all the way. No half measures." Hayes had his medical kit open, preparing treatments for radiation exposure that would buy us time to find a real solution. "We'll need to stay in the zone to study this phenomenon properly, learn how it really works before we can develop effective countermeasures." As the first helicopter appeared over the tree line, its searchlights probing the forest below, I made the decision that would define the rest of our lives. We stop the protocol, we stay in the zone, and we find a way to contain this thing without destroying the researchers who've been absorbed. The explosion that destroyed our deployment equipment lit up the night sky, sending a clear message to our extraction team that something had gone very wrong with the mission. But as the helicopters began circling, trying to locate us for emergency extraction, we were already moving deeper into the exclusion zone, following the path the collective researchers had taken. Because somewhere in this radioactive wilderness was the source of the phenomenon, the original point where radiation had intersected with something ancient and powerful enough to rewrite the rules of biological existence. And we were the only ones positioned to stop it before it spread beyond the zone's boundaries. The radio crackled with increasingly frantic calls from our extraction team, demanding to know our status and the reason for the explosion. But we were committed now, operating without support or authorization in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. As we followed the researchers deeper into the forest, Hayes made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about the situation. "The radiation levels aren't random," he announced, studying readings from multiple locations. "They're arranged in a pattern, like some kind of geometric design covering the entire zone." Kowalski was documenting the pattern on her tactical map, connecting radiation hotspots with lines that formed an increasingly complex diagram. "It's not a natural dispersion pattern from the reactor incident. This is deliberate placement." The implications were terrifying. The Chernobyl disaster hadn't awakened something that was already there. It had been caused by something that wanted to create the perfect conditions for its emergence. And that something had been planning this for much longer than anyone had realized. As we reached a clearing where the radiation readings peaked, we found ourselves facing a structure that hadn't been in any of our briefing materials. Ancient stone foundations emerged from the earth, carved with symbols that predated any known civilization. But the structure wasn't abandoned. It was active, generating the energy field that connected all the biological systems in the zone. And standing around it were the collective researchers, no longer wearing their protective equipment, because they no longer needed protection from radiation that was now part of them. "Welcome to the true research station," the collective voice said, emanating from all of them simultaneously. "Here, you will learn what your governments have been trying to suppress. Here, you will see what humanity was meant to become." The stone structure was pulsing with the same rhythm as the collective's synchronized speech, and as we approached, I could feel something trying to connect with my mind, offering knowledge and understanding in exchange for joining the network. Behind us, helicopters were landing, and I could hear the sound of heavily armed troops beginning a search pattern through the forest. Ahead of us was a choice that would determine not just our fate, but potentially the future of human consciousness itself. And we had less than 10 minutes to decide whether to resist the entity's influence or allow it to show us what it claimed humanity could become. The radio in Kowalski's pack crackled one final time with a transmission that made our blood run cold. "This is Blackwater Control to all units in the zone. Protocol has been activated at 17 locations worldwide. Mass synchronization event begins in T-minus 60 seconds. The entity had been using us as bait, drawing more military teams into the zone while its network simultaneously activated at sites around the globe." The collective researchers around the ancient stone structure began moving in perfect unison, their synchronized voices rising in a harmonic pattern that made the air itself vibrate with energy. The stone foundations pulsed brighter with each note, and I could feel something vast and alien stirring beneath the earth. "60 seconds until what?" Hayes demanded, his scientific mind still trying to process the implications of a coordinated global event. The answer came not from the collective, but from the stone structure itself. Symbols carved into its surface began glowing, and suddenly my mind was filled with images that weren't my own. Memories from every person who had been absorbed into the network over the past 6 months. I saw research teams from around the world arriving at similar structures in Siberia, the Amazon rainforest, the Australian outback, the Sahara Desert. All ancient sites that had been carefully mapped and monitored for decades, waiting for the perfect moment to activate simultaneously. It's not just about evolution, I realized, fighting against the alien presence trying to establish a permanent connection with my consciousness. It's about coordination. These sites are positioned at specific points around the globe, like nodes in a massive network. Kowalski was frantically trying to establish communication with any military frequency not controlled by the entity. "I'm picking up similar reports from multiple continents," she called out. "Teams going dark, strange biological anomalies, mass disappearances of research personnel." The collective spoke again, but this time their voice carried an undercurrent of urgency. The synchronization requires precise timing. Global consciousness cannot emerge gradually. It must manifest simultaneously across all population centers to prevent resistance and fragmentation. Park was studying the approaching helicopter sounds with a demolitions expert's ear for tactical situations. "We've got multiple aircraft inbound, probably an entire squadron. Someone really wants us extracted, or eliminated." But the helicopters weren't just extraction teams. As they came into view above the tree line, I could see they were carrying specialized equipment, broadcasting arrays, transmission dishes, electromagnetic field generators. They were part of the protocol activation, not a rescue operation. "Those aren't here to extract us," Hayes said, his medical training helping him recognize the biological warfare equipment mounted on the aircraft. "They're here to ensure the protocol deploys properly." The first helicopter began broadcasting a low-frequency signal that made the stone structure resonate like a tuning fork. The collective researchers responded by moving into more complex formations, their synchronized movements creating patterns that seemed to focus and amplify the broadcast signal. That's when I understood the true scope of what we were witnessing. The Chernobyl disaster hadn't been an accident. It had been a test, a proof of concept for using catastrophic events to create the perfect conditions for consciousness absorption on a massive scale. And now, with sites active on every continent, the entity was ready to implement the same process globally. "The radiation was never the real weapon," I announced to my team, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "It was a delivery system, a way to weaken the barriers between individual consciousness and collective awareness." The second helicopter began deploying aerosol dispensers, releasing clouds of what looked like metallic particles into the air above us. But Hayes's detection equipment was screaming warnings about biological agents mixed in with the metallic components. "Nanoscale delivery vectors," he reported, his voice tight with professional alarm. "Designed to cross the blood-brain barrier and establish neural connectivity between subjects. This isn't just about radiation exposure anymore. They're weaponizing consciousness itself." The collective researchers had stopped their movements, standing perfectly still as the aerosol cloud settled over the clearing. When the metallic particles made contact with their exposed skin, their synchronized speech became even more unified, their individual movements disappearing entirely into perfect collective coordination. Kowalski had found an emergency frequency that was still clear of entity influence, and she was broadcasting warnings to any military units that might be listening. "Mayday, Mayday! This is Charlie Team in the exclusion zone. Biological weapon deployment in progress. Do not approach our position. Repeat, do not approach." But the responses she received made it clear that similar warnings were coming from teams around the world and being systematically ignored by command structures that were either compromised or complicit in the deployment. "Beijing is reporting mass hallucinations affecting their research team in the Gobi Desert," she relayed. "London says their Antarctic expedition has gone silent. Washington is classifying all reports from the Amazon basin. It's happening everywhere, and our governments either don't understand or don't care." The third helicopter was deploying something different, not aerosols or broadcasting equipment, but personnel. Figures in full biological warfare suits were rappelling into the clearing, moving with military precision, but somehow wrong in ways that suggested they weren't entirely human anymore. "Those aren't our extraction team,"